Today's presentation is an end-to-end walkthrough of a construction process. There are steps here that are simplified just for the sake of time, but we will try to take you through a journey of setting up a new project, planning for that project, tracking consumption of that project, and also, of course, invoicing in the end. We'll start with setting up a new project. I will use a guide to set this up. And here I have a number of different templates. The idea is that you have different templates for different kinds of projects. The templates include all the information related to that kind of project. That could be invoicing rules, it could be the general setup of responsibilities, and of course it could also be the work breakdown structure or the cost breakdown structure of the project. In this case, I will take a simple construction project. I will also select a customer, and I will select a project manager from my list of project managers. And with that, I get a project created that I can open up based on my template. We can see on this project that I have a work breakdown structure with a number of different activities. These could look different in different cases. This is a very simple example. But most important is that I have a number of activities. There is the original work, and then I have some variations at the end for any extra work that could be performed. With that, let's get into planning for this project. We can look at the project plan in a Gantt chart. And because we originally created this from a template, we can also see that we already have a timeline for this project where the different activities have an expected time and an expected relationship between the different tasks. Now, I can, of course, adjust these according to the needs of the project. This is just a suggestion. So we could move something out and say that we expect the procurement to take longer, for instance, or shorter, or we change the timeline overall. This is general planning procedures anyway. And we can always save this out as a PDF to share either with the customer or internally for planning purposes. Later on, when we have created a budget and actually start to incur cost, we will also see that the columns for budget cost and actual cost, they will fill in, and the effort completed will increase, so we can use this as a dashboard to track our project progress. Back to our project plan, we now have a high-level timeline, and then we can start looking at a budget. The budget for the project we can create in multiple different ways. We could create it using a budget matrix where we create it entry by entry. We could copy it from another project. We could transfer entries. We could recalculate. We could create recurring entries, etc. But in this case, I will simply go in and import a budget that I have prepared in Excel, and I will open up a file here that I have as an Excel sheet with my budget, and I can import that directly into my system. So this could be an example of something where you have another system where you prepare the budget, and here we simply import it. So with that, we get a budget into our system. The budget, of course, has both quantities and prices. So if we, for instance, look at this design activity, we can see it says 1,248. That is the expected cost. If I drill down in my actual budget, I had set this to be 24 hours of time. So there's both a time aspect and monetary aspect. In this case, there can also be an expected rate for this project. We will build it out at a fixed price, but it could give us an indication of what the project price in the end should be. So we can see here that we have a cost of 1,248, and standard rate would give us a price for this of 728. So there's a bit of a margin in here. With this, we now have a high-level plan and we have a budget. The next step would be going into planning, and there are different parts of planning. There is both the planning on item level, so the materials, but there's also the resources. For the items, we can again take from our budget where we had some materials. They are under the procurement task, and we could say, let's move those over to something we will plan procurement for. And we do that with a budget planning update. Here I can see the different things I've budgeted for. That is resource time by different people, but also some items. In this case, I'll only plan for procuring the items as we will have the resources internally. But we could also add the resources for procurement if we were buying time from the outside, such as subcontract, and we can use this as a way to create a subcontract order. I then open up my planning lines, and here I can see that I have one line, in this case for this item. It says materials, 10 pieces, and expected cost. And I can see in this case that it has pre-selected a vendor for this piece of material. I can of course change the vendor, and here we're moving out of the project side of things and into the materials resource planning. From here there are two different ways of going. I can either create a specific purchase order for this project, and then it will be earmarked and reserved for this project. I could also say this is something I will take out of stock, but I now know that I have a bigger demand for this kind of item, and so it should go into the general inventory planning for the materials resource planning. If I'm going for the materials resource planning, I would use the order planning or requisition worksheet. I will not cover this in detail, but in here you calculate a plan for what you need. It will sum up the different needs across different projects, and you can then procure based on that. You could also do the special order route and instead say, yes, I would like to create a purchase order for this, and then say process purchase order actions. That creates a purchase order. We can see that in here. And I now have a purchase order for this vendor for 10 pieces of materials. In my project plan, I can now see that I have a reserved purchase for this amount. Now, in the end, it turned out that this was a much larger amount than what I expected this to be. So there's a discrepancy. That is because I expected a much lower price in my budget than what this vendor actually have on their price list. So I need to manage that. The other part of planning we could do is resource planning. And resource planning is when we take time that is set aside for people to spend and put it out in blocks of time against a calendar. I can do that for a specific project, but I could also look at it on a company level or a group level. And I'll do that in this case. I will open up the resource board. And from within here, I can see the different resources I have and how much they are planned to work on different days. We can see, for instance, that Cassie here, who is a consultant, is planned to work 7 hours on the Long Hill 3 project on Monday. But on Tuesday, she's only scheduled to work for 3 hours, meaning she doesn't have a full day. And thus this is colored red because she is underutilized. So we want to get to a level where people are utilized fully, but not overutilized. I can replan in here, so I could move this to Monday just to create an example. And we will now see that the Monday is now overutilized, being 2 hours over the limit of her capacity. So here we are tracking the capacity of every individual, also taking non-working days and bank holidays, etc. into consideration. But what about the time I budgeted for? I should move this into planning. I'll open up the import budget function and select my project. And with that, I can create these work assignments. And it says 5 work assignments were created. We can see in here that it put them all on Monday because my budget wasn't detailed on when it should be done. I'll leave that for this planning exercise. And so we could actually move this to a monthly view to see a bit of a longer timeline and see that probably the 8 hours, they are sitting well there. Then we will move the 16 hours here, and the 24 hours we could move here, or we could move them into next week. But this is on the level of consultants. We still haven't decided who it will be. So maybe it makes more sense to actually assign someone to it. In this case, I could move it down to Connie because she has plenty of time. And now we have a schedule of work to be done. We can then work with different statuses on this. So I could say this is maybe a tentative planning, but this on the other hand is a confirmed. And this could be performed by different individuals within the organization. You can give different rules and permissions for who can decide on this and who can move things around. I could also look at the resource planning from a project perspective. So if I go back to my project and open up my resource planner, I will see a view of only this project with the resource planning. And again, let's look at a period of time. I can see here that I had my feasibility. That was planned in my high-level design to be at this point. I placed it a little bit later because that's where there was available time. So we're a little bit behind on schedule. For the detailed design, it fits very nicely within the window that we defined in the Gantt chart. And that also goes for the construction phase, which fits in well here. But I can move things around. So I could move this earlier or later. I simply drag it and drop it to another day. I can also reassign, I can split these things up, etc. There's a lot of different functions and features. This resource board and resource planning also creates then an individual resource plan and board. So I can see for an individual what that person is planned to do on different days in a period, and I get an overview of their utilization versus their capacity. At this point, we now have a plan in place for this project. We have planned for the materials, we have planned for the resources. But what happens if there are changes? What happens if we realize that this budget doesn't hold anymore? We can, of course, change the budget at any point in time, but we can also create an alternate version of the budget. And this is where we introduce budget versions. I can say create a new budget version, and I could say, well, I would like to make a estimate at completion. This could also be a revision. And then I have a new alternate budget. Now this looks exactly the same, but in this case, I could open up the budget and make changes. Here I will do it with a budget matrix. And we can see that we have time for the resource group of consultants. Let's say we had the 8, 16, and here down 40 hours. Maybe I realize that I now need 50 hours of time. I can make that change. And now this is a change in this budget version. And I have two different versions of my budget. I had my original and I have my other. So here we see the budget is 2,600 for the construction part. If I go back to my other budget version, it now says that it's 2,080. I can work with multiple different versions of my budget. Later on, I can report on this, look at the differences between different budget versions. There's also the possibility to set up approval rules for budgets. Now, in my small company, I don't need anybody else to approve my budget, but there is a possibility to set that budget changes must be approved. And we can actually see in here that we have our budgets. Some of them are active and some of them are locked. If you have approvals on a budget version, it will be locked after approval. So you cannot just make changes without re-requesting approval again. I mentioned that we could have subcontracting as well as a cost in this project, and probably should plan for it. Now, I could have created a purchase order just as I did for materials, but in this case, I will use a subcontracting module to create a subcontract. I open up my subcontract vendors to find a suitable vendor. I have two vendors that are designated as subcontractors. This is a subset of all the vendors I have in the system, as some vendors might not be subcontractors. They could be material suppliers or even utilities, etc., that are created as vendors, but only some of them are subcontractors. Here we have one of the subcontractors. It's first of consultants. There is a status on them as a subcontractor, and I also have some details on them, whether they are preferred vendor and whether they have insurances for different kinds of purposes. In this case, they have a 5 million insurance that is valid until the end of 2013. So there is no issue with using that, but I can set up rules to warn about or even block using vendors who don't have the appropriate insurances. I can then create a subcontract. That subcontract is for a specific project. In this case, I will take my construction project. I can give a description, some work in this case, and I'll designate the subcontract vendor. I decided on first of consultants. I can also designate additional types and terms, etc. I will skip that at this point and go directly into entering the details. So in some regards, this is similar to a purchase order, but there are some twists and turns to it. One of them is that I create my additional lines in here, and here I specify directly what the rate and what I will be charging for. So we could say this will be for resource time. This will be for services. I consider that to be labor in this case. And we will expect to use 10 hours of time at a rate of 99. That is our agreed rate with this subcontractor. I can also put in rules for retention. If there are retention rules, this is not related to the statutory retention for subcontractors. This is if we are not paying in full until approval, etc. So I can put in a retention on this and retain a certain percentage. Let's say it's 5%, 10%, etc. And so with this, I have my subcontract and it is ready to go. Later on, if there are changes, I can manage that with change orders on the subcontract to track the changes that are made. So it's not just me changing the subcontract, I'm specifying what the change orders are to that subcontract. We'll get back to the subcontract a little bit later. And now most of my project is planned out. There is an additional way of planning for work. If there are items of work that you want to track more specifically, so tasks that are to be done, not just big blocks of time, you can use what we call work items. And work items is a specified piece of work assigned to an individual, possibly with multiple steps to perform, and that is tracked over time. Here, I would like to create a work item. And I will use a template for this. I have different templates for my work items, and I might have to create a survey. So I will use the survey template, and we get a templated task for a survey. It's currently not assigned to anyone, and we haven't set any timeline on it. But what we do have is the possibility to have a checklist of things that should be done. So there could be multiple steps. There could be step 1, step 2, etc. And as they are performed, we are checking these off and marking these as complete. We could even break these down into sub-work items to assign to someone else. But I can put this on the timeline and say we should be done with this by the end of next week, and we should start by the beginning of next week. And I will assign this to Cassie in this case. Now, Cassie doesn't exist in the real world, but in normal situations, there will be sent an email to her notifying that he has this piece of work to be done. I can, of course, always reassign it to someone else. In this case, I'm logged in as Prakash, and I can reassign it over to Prakash. That is me. I can also track the progress of this. This is currently not started, but as soon as I started, I would move it over to being in progress. And these work items, of course, add up, and they become part of a bigger plan of what I need to do as an individual, and also what people in general are looking at across the company as pieces of work. If we're looking at this at the bigger picture, we could look at the general work items we have in this company, and I can look at these as a Kanban board where I can see what people have to do. Cassie, for instance, has these 2 tasks. They are currently to do, and this one is overdue. Claire has something that is already done. Connie has something that is in inspection. Prakash has a lot of different things ongoing. And I can look at this in different ways. This is by resource. I could also look at this by project or customer. And we can see that for this construction project, we have a lot of different things ongoing. And as we go through it, we can track the progress and we can move them out and say that something is done or not done. Maybe this is now done, and I can move it over here as being completed. That is all our planning done. Let's move into actually tracking some costs and consumption on this project. One of the main points here is, of course, time. As an individual working on this project, I would like to track my time. Now, I can track my time in multiple different ways. One of them is with our tracking function. This can be activated from within the web interface, which might work well if you are in the office. There is also a Windows application if you're more still working on a desktop and want to track your planning work or your design work, etc. And there is, of course, a mobile application. It looks a bit similar to what we see here, but of course in a much optimized form. And if I use this, I can start the tracker with the start button, and then I can select what I'm working on. That could be based on a work item. So in this case, I could say I am doing this site survey. And that automatically fills in the project and task. So I don't need to know about the project and task. And it starts tracking at this current time. Then I say, okay. And as soon as I'm done, I go in and I say stop, and it stops tracking my time. As I do that throughout the week, that creates a number of entries. They show up in my time tracking calendar. And we can see in here that I have some time tracked on this. Of course, I can adjust it. If I actually started a little bit earlier, I could move this to an earlier start. I can stretch it out to be longer, etc., to adjust for the real time. In some cases, you want to allow this. In others, you wouldn't allow this. But this gives me some time. And it also gives me a graphical overview of what I did at different times during the day. If I have time that is manually tracked without an end and start time, I can always drag that in. And so that also becomes a block of time here. And when I have this done for the whole week, then I can update my timesheet with these entries, and then I can submit my timesheet. The timesheet itself is just a summary of all that information. So we can see here that on my timesheet, I have my different projects and how much time I spent on the different days. So again, here on Monday, 2 hours on this and 2.5 hours on this task. If you don't want to use the tracking feature, you can just go directly to the timesheet and enter in the number of hours and say it was 5 hours on Tuesday as well, and maybe 2 hours on Wednesday. So that is a way to do it. It's also possible to use what was planned in the resource planning as a basis and say update with work assignments. That will automatically create entries in here for whatever you plan to work on, and then you can adjust accordingly. After submitting the timesheet, this time will go into time approval. And so whoever is set up as the approver or the approvers will need to approve the time. In this case, it happens to be me. I can see I have a week here for approval of time, 11.5 hours. I can either go in and look at the details, or I can immediately approve it. In the details, I can of course also reject the time. And by approving, this now becomes cost on the project itself. If we open up here, we can see that we now have actual cost incurred on the feasibility phase of this project. We haven't used the entire budget. We have budgeted for cost of 800. We used about 500, so we have about 300 left on the budget. I can also use this information to send alerts to the project manager when we get close to or above the budgeted amount here. That was the time tracking. Other ways of tracking cost would of course be materials consumption, which we could track, and that would usually be when we get an invoice for it, we would pay that invoice and then that gets to be cost. That is almost outside the project side of it. It's more in the accounts payable and the materials management, so I'll not cover this for the sake of time. The other part we looked at was the subcontracting. We created a subcontract early on. This was the subcontract where we said we expected them to spend up to 10 hours of work on this. We could say at some point they have performed some work and they have a payment request for us. So I create a new payment request. They would like to get paid for their work on this project and for this specific subcontract. And then I can go down and look at the lines, and they have a request to say we have performed half the work. So I say put in here 50% of the work. That of course means in this case 5 units requested. With this, I can then submit the payment request, and there can be an approval process with up to 3 approvers to approve that this was actually done. So there could be a QS in the loop approving this. It could also be the QS actually putting in these numbers. I'll submit this payment request, and now we have a request for payment to be done to this subcontractor. And from this, I can go in and create a subcontractor payment, or in this case, a self-billing invoice based on this payment request for those 5 hours of time. I would simply go in and say create invoice or create a memo, and it creates a document in here that I can then later pay out. We have incurred different kinds of cost on the projects. It is time to actually get paid as well. Getting paid on construction project is often case a fixed price engagement, either as a number of milestones to be paid for or as progress or application billing. In this scenario, we will be looking at the application billing. I will open this up. We call it progress billing here, and I will create a new progress billing setup. So this is for our construction project, and we will start from a certain date. Let's say we are applying from the 1st of June until now. I will need to set up my lines on this. I will create a number of lines in this that correspond to what we are invoicing for. This does not have to correspond to the work breakdown structure. In this case, we have one task for construction, but we might actually be billing this out in different phases of different parts. So I could say phase 1 and put in a scheduled amount. We will charge 3,000 for, and we might as well have a phase 2 where we also say this is for the same task, but in this case, it is not for phase 1, but it is for phase 2. And for phase 2, we will charge 4,000. So this is our plan of what we want to charge for. We could also work with retention, putting on a percentage, either a default percentage that will cover the entirety of all the lines we have, or it could be on a line level that we put in a specific percentage that only applies to that one line. If we create retention, that will later on then be created as retention entries. They will be deducted from whatever we invoice, and then we can release those at a later point in time. I now have this. And let's say we have performed part of the work. I will say we have performed 20% of phase 1. This is our application. This is our claim to the customer. And so I can print this out as a report. and I can send that to the customer. The report can of course have different layouts. This is a generic layout where we can see that there is a total amount, in this case 7,000. What we've taken so far is 600, so this is our claim. I can also of course get a breakdown of this, where we look at the different lines and see what percentages we're claiming for. In this case, we had phase 1 at 3,000, which we are claiming 600 for, which is the 20%. For phase 2, we are not claiming anything at this point. We then get a reply from the customer, them either accepting or rejecting this. And in this case, let's say they rejected it. Then we will create a new version. And so we will void this, but remember that we actually try to claim for 20% and say, yes, they can accept 17%. And this is now what they accept. And so we mark this as approved. So we have a history of the different claims that we've done and what have been accepted. With this, we can then say, let's raise an invoice for it. And this will automatically create an invoice that we can send to the customer. Then we will go for the next period of time at some point where we will say, let's create a new application. And on the new application, that might be from the 16th until the 30th, for instance, those 2 weeks. And at that point, we might be going for 35% and we repeat the process, etc. With that done, we have now also been able to bill the customer. Whatever we bill the customer, that is one thing. But what about the revenue and the income? The revenue recognition on a construction project is usually based on the completion of the project, not necessarily what we invoice. Those two can go hand in hand, but we usually look at our actual estimated completion at this point. The way we would do that is across our projects, we will look at project completion and then we will calculate. For the WIP process, I will open up our WIP and Revenue Recognition worksheet where I can see all the different projects. And I can see that on this project, for instance, we have a calculated completion of 8.9626%. That is the system calculated based on the budget we created and the actual cost incurred. This can be the basis for our WIP calculation, but we can also override this should we have a different estimation and say, well, actually, we are not really that far off, but we are maybe at 8%, then I can put in 8% as an override. And this will be the percentage that we will use for our WIP calculation. So this is the process end to end. We start with creating a project. We plan for it. We budget for it. We plan our resources. We plan the work. We track the cost as time, purchases, subcontracting. And in the end, we also, of course, raise a invoice to the customer based on applications. And then we do the revenue recognition.